Today we have with us Dr. Prashant Sharma, founder Dharma Alliance, situated at Geneva. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us for this conversation. First and foremost, sir, I would want to know your understanding of the exhibition that has been put up and the views of Maharajji.
Maharajji, I've had the good fortune of having some engagement and interactions with him in the past. And of course, I think one of the most important things he has, of course, a big, grand picture with depth, which is a rare combination. Also, he comes at it from a deeply understood civilizational history of India. So I think his understanding is that much more layered. It's also quite rare to have a spiritual leader who is taking and thinking about and sharing his ideas on current contemporary geopolitical processes, but looking at it from a very deeply Shastric perspective. And that's not very common, again. So it's been a very enriching experience having the conversations with him. And he has, and if there's one thing I can say, it's also because of the sheer depth and complexity of some of these thoughts, it requires many sessions with him to also get, understand the different layers and the levels at which he's providing this guidance. So it's been extremely enriching, still ruminating, still mulling over many of the things which he said, and I think the penny keeps dropping often enough, but at some point I think it all will come. It's coming together in a beautiful.
Nice. With that, I move to my next question, which is essentially on the deliberation that we had. We had a varied perspective on multilateralism and how the international organizations hold relevance today and the position of India as such. So what are your takes on it, and how do you see the relevance of United Nations organization today and the position of India in the sense of entering into as a veto power or a permanent 5 members and keeping its perspective on the global table today?
Right. See, as during the deliberations, as you must have also observed, that it's a very layered question. It has a lot of history in it, and it's not a simple, straightforward question. What one can say in being in Geneva, which is the global hub of multilateralism, it does give a particular perspective and a particular view on things. It's not just about the fact of India being in the P5. It's not just about India's influence and role in these processes. It's a much bigger question of what because there is a crisis of multilateralism. There is a growing sense that there is the relevance of many of these institutions is falling. It's not representative. These institutions and these frameworks, they don't necessarily reflect the current realities. So while this is a challenge to multilateralism, at the same time, I think there's a general consensus that this is what we have. Now, the question really becomes, therefore, how do we make this system and these frameworks more fit for purpose, particularly in the contemporary environment? And that's where the challenge lies. So I think some of these broader civilizational ideas are ideas which have so far not really been shared and been on the table. And that's, in fact, the role that Dharma Alliance is performing, translating civilizational ethics of large part of the world, 2 or 3 billion people, depending on how you count it. How some of those ideas and that depth of thought can be translated into contemporary policies and contemporary multilateralism. How to make multilateralism much more relevant and acceptable to large parts of the world which have so far not been at the table. So that's the challenge. If, as a part of it, one can see the idea of whether India should be on the P5 or not P5, or whether P5 itself as a structure is an important one, and so on and so forth. So these are questions which have to be asked. But the bigger picture in terms of multilateralism as a whole, and how we must ensure that they represent the ideas, thoughts, frameworks of large parts of the world which have not been at the table, how can we ensure that they have a more relevance? And one of the things which we work with, one of the mottos we work with, if you will, is universality without uniformity. So that's very important to keep in mind, simply because otherwise it's the reason why, part of the reason why the relevance has fallen is because it's been very monocultural. And in fact, the External Affairs Minister also a few years ago said something about the rebalancing of global structures. And one of the points which he made very strongly was the fact that we now need to move towards a cultural rebalance. The economic and political rebalancing is obvious for all of us to see. But the cultural rebalancing, meaning what are the principles on which a decision is considered to be right or wrong, or what are the basis of the consensus building. So that's something which we have to move towards, and it's a process which is ongoing.
The change of position in terms of India on a global level 15 years back and today, in terms of keeping its interest, in terms of negotiating its interest, in terms of prioritizing itself without aligning with either sides. So how do you see that, and how do you think we can continue doing that in a more effective way?
Well, I think India's done a fantastic job, particularly in the last, I would say, 10, 12 years or so. I mean, I think the stature of India has definitely risen, not just within the multilateral system, but also in public consciousness in other parts of the world.
Right.
And that's very important. There is definitely a much larger presence, there's greater appreciation. But with all of these things, there's also going to be pushback, because existing structures are not going to easily give up their control, whether it's over the institutions or the narrative for that matter. So there will be challenges, but I think part of it, and these challenges have to be handled at different levels in parallel. We can't say that when we reach this particular stage in our economic growth, then we will do this. So it has to be done in parallel. So we have to have actions and work which is happening at the national level, at the regional level, and so on and so forth. But also in parallel, we have to work at the multilateral level. And we have to, but the important thing is, particularly in the multilateral level, there is a role for pointing out the flaws of the current system, which is important. But most people now understand it. The question, I think, has to move beyond that and say, what solutions are we offering? And that's something which I don't think we are focused enough on. It's one thing to keep saying, look, this whole thing is completely skewed. And fine. I mean, everybody, I don't think nobody's going to reject that idea. But now we have to move beyond calling out limitations and say, okay, yes, we understand the limitations. Yes, but here are things which we are offering. And that's when we have to go back to our civilizational roots. Because our civilization roots, by definition, and our thought process, our framework, by definition, are open systems. And it's that open system approach which we have to promote at the global level, where diversity is not a slap-on, it's not an add-on. It's something which is baked into our frameworks, our worldviews. And that particular understanding, if we can translate, because everybody talks about diversity and plurality, but we live it. And we live it primarily because it's part of our ethos and our history and the way we look at the world. Can we share that wisdom, but doing it in a broad-based manner where we are able to take everybody along? Not simply by pointing out the flaws in other systems, but essentially saying there are many ways of looking at the world. And here is another way, and this is a way which is therefore literally Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So which is orientated towards that. But that has to be done in a gentle and a consensus building fashion, rather than simply pointing fingers. So I think a positive, constructive approach is required, particularly in the multilateral
More
level.
solution-centric.
Yeah, solution-centric. While at the same time, yes, I mean, where there is pushback, then I think certain the tone can be changed. So, but many things have to happen in parallel, in different institutions and different types of institutions and different groups have to play different roles in that process.
If policymakers take one idea from this discussion that we had today, what should it be?
Open systems, I would always say. I mean, always bat for open systems. And we are structurally an open society. We don't need, it's not something to be stabbed on. In one of the discussions I was having in a conference, in a multilateral setting, there was this discussion, you have to put in laws and processes in policies to manage diversity. And that's exactly the problem. That when you have to manage diversity, then you're already entering that discussion with a closed mind. It's a closed system approach. That is something to be managed. While from our perspective, which is structurally open, we are looking at things that diversity is. That's the normal default state of the world. Now, how do we translate it into policies which will support that worldview? Which will support that worldview. And for example, I mean, you have examples like making sure the African Union is part of the G20. You have to make sure that everybody, focus on some of the smaller countries, some of the countries which have relatively less influence over these processes, bring them on board, essentially put your, translate those principles into action at the multilateral level.
But sir, in the same context, if I may take forward this too, the acceptance part is also very important. I think introducing the values that we have, but simultaneously we need to have that kind of acceptance and inclusion also, because without that, even if we take our civilizational values forward and we move forward to creating the system as such, if we do not get that kind of acceptance and recognition of our own values, and in the same sense, like if we are not recognized that okay, these are the civilizational values of the global south, particularly these are the civilizational value of Bharat, and these have to be inculcated globally. So in that context, sir, we need to be recognized at the first place. We need to have that kind of position to have ourselves recognized and our values accepted globally in order to hold some more
influence. You're absolutely right. But then there are two or three things I'll highlight in this context. One is, of course, this is a process. It's not something overnight which can be just, it's a process. Second thing is, I think it's about framing and positioning. Now, when you say our values, are we already saying that this is only Indian values? So we have to be very key. So we say no. We can say that these are human values. These are human values which are found across the world. Yes, we have a lot of terminology, a lot of our sacred texts, a lot of it. We've got a far more sophisticated and a much more in-depth understanding, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist in other parts of the world. So if then we have to really truly imbibe the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Most ancient societies across the world, unfortunately, many of them have been destroyed, whether it's in South America or Latin America or even in the First Nations in North America. Across Europe, many of the civilizations which were the ancient civilizations of Europe, they've been decimated. Across Africa, across the world. Most ancient traditions have tremendous amounts of overlap with dharmic approaches. Reverence for nature, the whole idea of family as a unit, the whole idea of looking out for each other. In Africa, everybody's heard of this stuff, Ubuntu, I am because we are. Yes. So all cultures, all societies have these roots, because that's how the world has progressed. Because they're nature based, as we were discussing in one of the sessions that this morning, that the forest, literally the links with the forest with earth is what has provided the worldviews for many, many, many society. So this notion of our, I think in some ways, again, it depends on what the audience is. Of course, it has to be contextual, because if you're working in India, we have to take greater pride in our Indianness. But when we are working at the multilateral level, we have to broad base it a lot more. We have to say, look, this is something which is not just unique to India. Many societies, it's just that we are in a better place because we are economically stronger, or we kept some of the traditions more, where they've been around for, we managed to keep them rather than. So can we support those processes? Can we support those ideas? How can we play a supportive role to make this whole idea broad-based? So I think it's if we approach it in that particular manner, the framing, the positioning, and moving in from a truly a felt understanding of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, rather than saying, look, this is owed to us. Nothing is owed to anybody. Nothing is owed to anybody. It's not a right as such. But we have to build a consensus. So that's a longer haul. It takes longer. It takes more time.
Essentially, the principles remains the same. Terminology is different.
Terminology, the manifestations, how they come across, how people practice it. I mean, Peru, if you go across, but if you meet some of those traditional society, which is still some of them are left. They are trying very hard to bring back some of those ideas. In Europe, across Europe, in Greece, you have the Hellenics, which are coming back. The Druids in France are coming back. In Iceland, in Norway, in many of the Scandinavian countries are bringing back the shamanic traditions. So all of these processes are ongoing. Are we able to provide a supporting environment for that? Are we able to provide a supporting framework for that? If we approach it like that, that this is something which is common human heritage, common human, and we share those ideas. And there's so many overlaps, so many tons of overlap. So when we broad base it, then it becomes much more also acceptable and something to be celebrated as shared humanity rather than only saying that look,
Country
this is
specific or
hereditary space. And this is, I mean, that is the essence of, and we are fortunate that we managed to, shall we say, survive the onslaught of many forces and keep some of these traditions alive. But at the same time, there are many who perhaps even need our support. And can we build that broader civilization-based ethics that and bring that ethical coherence into some of these multilateral spaces and language, which is what we are trying to do. Dharma Alliance, this is precisely our job. The dharmic ideas, karuna, anekantavad, all dharma itself.
Right.
So how are these terminology, how they're relevant?
Right.
But we stick to the core principle. We don't deviate from that. But to say it's much bigger than just us, these are wide, huge principles which have huge value for humanity. So I think it's that framing perspective aspect, which is framing positioning and going into it with a sense non-confrontation. We don't want to necessarily only say, look, you're wrong and I'm right, because then it's just doing the same thing which the world has been doing for the last 200 years. 100 years.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Thank you for this insightful conversation.
Pleasure always.